Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The Appalachian Trail, stretching over 2,090 miles from Georgia to Maine, has long been a destination for those seeking solitude, natural beauty, and escape from the pressures of modern life. But in a remote section crossing through the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, between the years of 1952 and 1958, something occurred that would remain buried in local folklore and obscure county records for decades. This is the authentic account of what has become known among researchers as the Blackburn Incident, a series of encounters that challenges our understanding of wilderness, solitude, and the lengths to which a person might go to protect what they consider theirs. It began with what locals called the Season of Strange Sounds. In the fall of 1952, residents of Floyd County, Virginia, reported unusual echoes carrying through the valleys at night. At first, most dismissed them as the natural sounds of the mountains, perhaps an unusual weather pattern or animal behavior. The Forest Service noted the reports but found no evidence of anything beyond normal wildlife activity. A local newspaper, the Floyd County Times, ran a small article on October 23, 1952, under the heading "Mountain Noises Puzzle Locals," quoting several residents who described wailing calls and mimicked bird sounds that don't match any known species. Marjorie Wilson, who operated a small general store in the community of Buffalo Mountain, told the newspaper, "It's like nothing I've ever heard before, and I've lived in these hills all my 67 years. Starts just after sunset and goes on till the early hours. Sometimes sounds like a person trying to copy a whippoorwill, but getting it just wrong enough that you know it ain't no bird. Other times it's more like a high singing kind of wail." My daddy used to tell stories about mountain spirits that would call to travelers, try to lead them astray. Never put much stock in those tales until now. Other residents reported similar experiences. Harold Jenkins, a farmer whose property bordered national forest land, described hearing a kind of conversation going on in the woods behind my place, like whistles and calls being answered from different ridges, back and forth, too coordinated for animals, but don't sound quite human either. Jenkins also claimed to have found unusual arrangements of stones at the edge of his fields on several occasions, which he initially attributed to local hunters marking trails. A retired coal miner named Everett Holcomb provided perhaps the most detailed description of the sounds. Anybody who spent time in a mine knows how sounds travel differently underground, how they can seem to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. These mountain calls are like that. They bounce around the valleys until you can't tell where they're coming from, but they got a pattern to them. 3 short whistles, then a long, low one, then 2 short again, over and over. And they're answered from somewhere else with the same pattern, but higher pitched, like they're talking to each other, using some kind of code. Been hearing them 3 nights a week for the past month, always starting at the same time, about an hour after sunset. Holcomb went on to describe his own theories about the source. Now, I don't hold with superstition, but these ain't normal sounds. My granddaddy used to talk about people who went deep into the mountains and never came back out, not because they died, but because they found something in there that changed them. Said they learned to talk to the mountains themselves, and the mountains talked back. Called them the listeners. Said they lived in the deepest hollows where no trails go, and they watched over places regular folks weren't meant to find. Always thought it was just stories to keep us young'uns from wandering too far. Now I'm not so sure. Leonard Pritchard, a forest ranger who had served the area for nearly 2 decades, documented these reports in his monthly logs. October 12, 1952. 3rd complaint this week about nocturnal disturbances, nothing found during patrols. Local consensus blames coyotes, though patterns seem unusual for typical pack behavior. A subsequent entry, dated October 29th, adds, Wilkins' family on Buffalo Mountain claims sounds are moving closer to inhabited areas, described as human but wrong somehow. Scheduled additional night patrol for coming weekend. This would be the first official documentation of what would later be connected to a much more disturbing pattern. Ranger Pritchard's logs from November 1952 show increasing concern about the phenomenon. November 2nd, conducted night patrol of Buffalo Mountain area with Deputy Ranger Collins. Heard unusual sounds approximately 2,300 hours. Series of whistles from Northwest Ridge, answered by similar sounds from southeast, continuing for approximately 20 minutes. Attempted to triangulate source, but sound ceased when we approached within estimated half-mile. No evidence of campfires or human presence found. A week later, Pritchard wrote, November 9th, second night patrol yielded physical evidence. Found crude shelter constructed of forest materials in ravine approximately 3 miles from nearest access road. Recent occupation evident from still warm ashes and small fire pit. Design unlike standard hunter's blind or recreational camper's setup, more permanent in nature with considerable effort made to conceal location. Photographed site but left undisturbed per Superintendent Harmon's instruction. Will monitor for return of occupant. Deputy Ranger Collins, who accompanied Pritchard on these patrols, would later recall additional details not included in the official reports. What Leonard didn't put in his logs was how that shelter made us both feel. It wasn't just crude, it was wrong somehow. Built in a way that didn't make sense, with the entrance barely big enough for a person to squeeze through, and the interior much larger than it appeared from outside, like whoever built it had hollowed out part of the hillside. There were marks scratched into the dirt floor, patterns, symbols, not random, but nothing we recognized either. And the strangest thing was the smell. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Kind of earthy, but with something else underneath. Leonard said it reminded him of the time he'd found a bear's winter den, but different. More deliberate, if that makes any sense. Collins described their exploration of the site. We found evidence that whoever was using that shelter had been there for some time. There were storage areas dug into the walls containing dried plant materials, some of which Leonard recognized as medicinal herbs, others he couldn't identify. There was a collection of small animal bones, cleaned and sorted by size and type. Most peculiar were the tools, crude but effective implements made from stone, wood, and animal parts, but with designs neither of us had seen before. Not like traditional native crafts or pioneer tools, but something different altogether. One thing in particular stuck with me, a kind of calendar or tracking system marked on a flat stone, using symbols to record what we guessed were phases of the moon and seasonal changes. Whoever made it was intelligent and organized, not just some random drifter or hermit. The phenomenon might have remained nothing more than an oddity had it not been for the discovery made by Hunter Elmer Radford in late November 1952. While tracking a wounded deer approximately 4 miles from the nearest road, Radford stumbled upon what he initially thought was an abandoned trapper's camp. In his statement to the Floyd County Sheriff's Department, dated November 28, 1952, Radford described finding a series of small shelters built against a rock face, partially underground, with carefully constructed brush coverings that made them nearly invisible unless you were right on top of them. Most disturbing to Radford was the evidence that someone had been observing him. I found a spot on the ridge above where someone had been laying for some time. There were marks in the dirt where they'd been watching me field dress the buck. Never heard or saw nobody, but they'd been there all right, watching every move I made. Found my cigarette butts collected in a little pile, too, like someone had gathered them up. Radford's statement continues with a detail that was omitted from the official police report. There was something else that gave me the willies. All around that camp there were these little figures made out of twigs and vines, hanging from branches. Some looked like stick people, others more like animals. Didn't seem right. Reminded me of things my grandmother used to talk about. Warnings or marks from the old mountain folk. I left that deer right there and got myself out quick as I could. Wasn't worth going back for, not for any amount of venison. In a later interview with Dr. Thornton in 1967, Radford would add further context to his experience. The feeling I had in that place, I've been hunting these mountains for 40 years, and I've never felt anything like it. It wasn't just being watched. It was like I was being studied, like something was taking notes on everything I did. And those little stick figures hanging from the trees, they weren't random. They were arranged in a perfect circle around where I'd been working on that deer, each one facing inward toward where I'd been standing. And I swear, though I know how crazy this sounds, they seemed to move a little when there wasn't any breeze. Just the slightest trembling, like they were vibrating somehow. Radford described other details he'd initially been reluctant to share. There was one more thing I found there that I didn't tell the sheriff about. In that observation spot where someone had been watching me, I found a piece of paper, not like regular writing paper, more like parchment, real thick and yellowish. Had a drawing on it that looked like it was done with charcoal or something. A drawing of me, kneeling over that deer, detailed enough that you could see my face clear as a photograph. But the thing is, it showed me from an angle that would have been impossible from where the watcher had been sitting. Wish now I'd kept it as proof, but at the time, I just wanted it gone. The sheriff's report indicates that Deputy Wallace Jenkins accompanied Radford back to the site 3 days later, only to find the entire area cleared of all evidence of habitation, with brush and leaves scattered to conceal any sign that structures had ever been present. Jenkins noted that the thoroughness of the removal suggests calculated intent rather than animal disturbance or natural weathering. What Jenkins didn't include in his official report, but later shared with colleagues at the county sheriff's office, was the discovery of a small carved wooden figure placed precisely where Radford had claimed to find the observation post. It showed me from the front, but they'd been behind me the whole time. I burned that paper as soon as I got home. The figure, roughly 6 inches tall and crudely fashioned from a single piece of hickory, depicted what appeared to be a human form with exaggerated ears and eyes. Jenkins initially kept the figure as a curiosity, but later surrendered it to federal authorities during their 1957 investigation. Its current whereabouts remain unknown. Deputy Jenkins would later describe his own unease during the follow-up investigation. I've been in law enforcement in these mountains for 22 years, seen all kinds of strange things, but that place gave me a chill I can't explain. The way everything had been so carefully removed, like someone had gone over every inch of ground to erase any sign they'd been there, except for that little wooden figure placed exactly where Radford said he'd felt someone watching him from. Almost like whoever it was wanted us to know they'd been there, but only on their terms. I brought that figure back because something told me it was important, but I didn't like having it in my house. Kept it in the shed until the feds took it. My wife said it made her uncomfortable, said she could feel it watching her through the walls. Jenkins added an observation about the figure's craftsmanship. That carving wasn't as crude as it first appeared. Looking at it closely, you could see incredibly fine detail work, especially in the eyes, which had these tiny pinprick pupils that seemed to follow you. The wood itself felt wrong somehow, too heavy for its size and warm to the touch, like it had been sitting in the sun even though I found it in the shade. The grain patterns didn't look quite natural either. Most hickory has a pretty standard grain, but this piece had these swirling patterns that almost looked like fingerprints. Like the wood grain itself had been manipulated somehow. I know that sounds impossible, but that's what it looked like. Local historian Amelia Carrington, in her 1972 book, Shadows in the Hollow, Forgotten Folklore of the Blue Ridge, connects these wooden figures to pre-Civil War traditions. The carved sentinels, as they were known among the most isolated mountain communities, served multiple purposes. An old mountain saying held that the sentinel watches when its maker sleeps. These practices had largely disappeared by the early 20th century, making their reappearance in the 1950s all the more remarkable. Carrington's research uncovered accounts from the early 19th century describing similar phenomena. A letter from 1823, written by a circuit preacher named Reverend Josiah McCreary, mentions his discomfort with what he called the watching idols he encountered in the most remote mountain settlements. They marked territorial boundaries, warned of potential dangers, and were believed to act as observers for those who placed them. He writes of finding crude figures carved of wood positioned at the edges of clearings, their unseeing eyes nonetheless conveying an uncanny sensation of observation. McCreary noted that local residents treated these figures with a mixture of respect and wariness, occasionally leaving small offerings of tobacco or salt beside them. When he questioned this practice, he was told simply, "They keep watch for those who dwell deep in the hollows." Carrington further elaborated on this tradition. The practice of carving sentinels appears to have originated among the earliest European settlers in these mountains, possibly incorporating elements from both European folk traditions and customs learned from indigenous peoples. The oldest documented examples date to the late 1700s, a time when these mountains were still largely unexplored wilderness. The sentinels were traditionally carved from a single piece of wood taken from a lightning-struck tree, as such wood was believed to retain some essence of the natural force that had transformed it. The most skilled carvers could reportedly imbue their creations with specific purposes, some to watch for strangers, others to monitor weather patterns, and some, most disturbingly, to keep count of those who passed by their domain. The sounds continued sporadically through the winter of 1952-1953, with reports clustering around the Buffalo Mountain area and along the streams that fed into the Little River. By spring, however, they had diminished, and local interest waned. The prevailing theory, as reported in the Floyd County Times in March 1953, was that a transient individual, possibly a war veteran or displaced person, had temporarily taken up residence in the deep woods before moving on as weather improved. This comfortable explanation was shattered in May of 1953 when a pair of hikers, James Whitaker and Thomas Caldwell, failed to arrive at their scheduled checkpoint near the Rocky Knob area. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen in their 30s, having hiked sections of the trail multiple times. Their disappearance prompted a standard search and rescue operation that, according to the official report filed with the Virginia State Police, found no evidence of foul play or accident. The report concluded that the men had likely decided to deviate from their registered route. The search operation was extensive, involving forest rangers, local volunteers, and eventually state police resources. A base camp was established at the Rocky Knob Recreation Area, with search teams conducting grid-pattern sweeps of the surrounding terrain for over a week. Tracking dogs were brought in, but reportedly became agitated and uncooperative in certain areas, refusing to follow trails that led into the deeper ravines east of the main hiking path. Earl Simmons, who participated in the search as a volunteer, later described the unusual behavior of the dogs. "I've worked with search and rescue dogs for 15 years, and I've never seen them act like that. These were well-trained animals used to working difficult terrain. But when we tried to take them down into what the locals call the deep hollow, they just flat-out refused, hackles up, tails tucked, pulling back on their leads. One of them, a German shepherd that had served in Korea, actually snapped at his handler when the man tried to urge him forward. Something down in that hollow spooked those dogs bad, and these were animals that would track through anything normally." Simmons recalled another troubling incident during the search. "We were working a grid about 4 miles east of where the men's campsite had been found, getting into some really rough country that wasn't on any of our maps. Started finding these weird markers, piles of stone stacked in ways that didn't look natural, tree branches bent and tied into shapes, that sort of thing. Our team leader, guy who'd grown up in the area, got real quiet when we pointed them out. Said we needed to turn back, that we were crossing into territory we shouldn't be in. Got into an argument with the state police coordinator who wanted to push on. Next morning, all our compasses were acting funny, spinning and pointing in different directions. The state police guy said it was just mineral deposits in the rocks affecting the magnetism. But our local guy packed up and left. Said he wouldn't go any further, not for any amount of money. Half our team went with him. What the official report failed to mention, but was documented in the personal notes of search coordinator Martin Yates, was the discovery of unusual markings at the men's last known campsite. Found series of symbols scratched into tree trunks surrounding the clearing, Yates wrote, distinct from standard trailblazes or forestry markings, appear deliberately placed to form a perimeter. Local guide suggests they resemble hobo signs but doesn't recognize specific meanings. One hiker's journal recovered from tent contains mention of feeling watched for previous 2 days. Yates noted further peculiarities. Campsite itself raises questions. Tent positioned in depression, offering minimal visibility of surrounding area, an unusual choice for experienced hikers. Personal items arranged in precise, seemingly deliberate patterns. Boots placed exactly parallel, clothing folded in identical square formations, cooking utensils aligned by size. Local guide suggests this is not consistent with either man's known camping habits, describes it as ritualistic. Most troubling is complete absence of track evidence leading away from camp in any direction, despite soft ground conditions following recent rainfall. A subsequent entry in Yates' notes reads, Day 5 of search. Team 3 reports unusual discovery approx. 2 miles east of primary search area. Appears to be some kind of shrine or marker constructed of natural materials. Stones arranged in spiral pattern around central post made of multiple tree branches bound together. Various objects suspended from branches. Feathers, small bones, pieces of cloth, and what appears to be a military dog tag. Tag 2 corroded to read name, but team leader believes it dates from WWI era based on design. No other evidence of human presence in immediate vicinity. Local guide becomes agitated upon seeing photographs, refuses to accompany team back to location, states only that it is a watching place and should not be disturbed. The journal recovered from the campsite, belonging to James Whitaker, contained several entries that would later gain significance in light of subsequent events. The final entry, dated May 14, 1953, read, Third night of strange noises. T thinks I'm imagining things, but I know something's out there. Caught glimpse of someone watching us from the ridgeline this afternoon. Tall figure, too far to make out details. T says it was just a deer. Not convinced. Found another one of those stone arrangements by the creek this morning. T knocked it over despite my objections. Bad feeling about this place. Suggesting we move on tomorrow, maybe head down to Mabry Mill area instead of continuing north as planned. An earlier entry, dated May 12th, provided additional context. Strange experience today. While gathering firewood, wandered farther from camp than intended. Came across a peculiar sight, a small clearing I swear wasn't on our map, with a circle of stones in the center. Stones had been arranged with obvious care, forming some kind of pattern that seemed deliberate but indecipherable. As I stood there, had the most intense feeling of being unwelcome, like trespassing in someone's home. No obvious cause, just a sudden, overwhelming sense of intrusion. Hurried back to camp. Haven't told T yet. He already thinks I'm jumpy. The journal contained further observations that suggested Whitaker had been increasingly concerned about their surroundings. May 13th. Found what looks like a primitive trail this morning, not on any of our maps. Narrow and barely visible in places, but definitely maintained by someone. T wanted to follow it, see where it led, but something told me that would be a very bad idea. Managed to convince him we should stick to the main trail. On the way back to camp, had that feeling of being watched again. Turned suddenly and caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, but whatever it was had already vanished. T says I'm letting the isolation get to me. Maybe he's right. A particularly troubling entry from May 13th continued. Woke in the middle of the night to find T gone from the tent. Panicked at first, then heard him talking to someone outside. Couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm of conversation. When I called out, everything went silent. Moments later, T came back in, said he'd just been answering nature's call. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he looked at me strangely and said he hadn't spoken to anyone. He seemed different somehow, too calm, almost detached. This morning he had no memory of getting up at all, says I must have been dreaming. But I found unfamiliar boot prints outside the tent, too large to be either of ours. T dismissed them as old prints we hadn't noticed before. I'm not convinced. The final pages contained a hastily written note that was partially obscured by what appeared to be water damage. Something circling the camp tonight. T doesn't hear it, but I do. Moves differently than an animal, too deliberate. Stops when I shine flashlight, starts again when light's off. T finally agreed to illegible tomorrow. Too illegible now. That whistling again. Closer this time. Think it's illegible communication. Illegible. More than one of them out there. 3 weeks later, Thomas Caldwell emerged from the woods nearly 40 miles from where the search had concentrated. According to medical records from Roanoke Memorial Hospital, he was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from exposure. The hospital intake forms noted patient exhibits signs of acute stress and possible traumatic psychological episode. What was peculiar, however, was Caldwell's insistence that he had only been lost for 2 days, not 3 weeks. The attending physician noted patient displays significant temporal disorientation, claims to have spent at most 2 nights in the forest despite physical evidence of prolonged exposure. When confronted with the actual date, patient became highly agitated. The initial medical assessment noted other anomalies. Patient's physical condition inconsistent with reported timeline. Beard growth and nail length suggest approximately 3 weeks without grooming, matching the period since his disappearance. However, degree of dehydration and malnutrition less severe than would be expected from extended wilderness exposure without adequate supplies. Some injuries appear to have partially healed, while others seem very recent. Most notable is pattern of minor lacerations and puncture wounds on extremities, possibly consistent with moving through dense underbrush, but unusual in their symmetrical arrangement. Dr. Margaret Holcomb, who treated Caldwell, wrote in her notes, "Patient appears to have a significant gap in memory. He becomes agitated when questioned about the missing time, and repeatedly asks about his companion. When informed that James Whitaker remained missing, Caldwell reportedly became distressed, repeating the phrase, 'He watches from the trees until sedated.' A psychiatric consultation was ordered, but by the time the specialist arrived the next morning, Caldwell had become almost entirely uncommunicative, responding to questions with only minimal gestures or single-word answers. Dr. Holcomb's notes continue with observations about Caldwell's physical condition. Patient exhibits unusual pattern of minor injuries and abnormalities inconsistent with typical wilderness exposure. Multiple small, precise incisions on forearms appear deliberate rather than accidental, possibly ritualistic in nature. Several fingernails show evidence of having been removed and partially regrown during the missing time period. Most peculiar is the presence of intricate scarification on upper back, pattern of interconnected lines that patient becomes extremely distressed when questioned about. Recommend full documentation and photography before discharge. The medical report includes a description of other physiological anomalies. Patient demonstrates significant muscular atrophy in lower extremities consistent with extended period of limited mobility, contradicting his claim of only being in the wilderness for 2 days. Conversely, upper body muscular development appears enhanced, particularly in the arms and shoulders. Calluses on hands inconsistent with patient's occupation as an office worker. Toxicology reveals presence of unidentified alkaloid compounds in bloodstream, possibly derived from plant sources. Samples sent to university laboratory for analysis. A supplementary report from the hospital laboratory added further mystery to Caldwell's condition. Analysis of blood samples shows presence of multiple unidentified compounds. Preliminary testing suggests some similarity to known alkaloids derived from various fungal and plant sources, but with molecular structures not matching any cataloged substances. Of particular interest is compound X37, which appears to have properties affecting temporal perception in laboratory mice. When administered in controlled setting, test subjects demonstrate altered responses to time-based stimuli, suggesting possible disruption of circadian rhythms and time sense. Unknown whether this could account for patients' temporal disorientation, but correlation is noteworthy. A nurse's aide named Sarah Dennison, who was assigned to Caldwell's care, later reported that during a period of semi-consciousness, he had spoken more clearly about his experience. In a statement given to investigators in 1957, Dennison recalled, "He said they had been separated after an argument. Said his friend had kicked over some stones arranged in a pattern near their camp, and that night someone came. Said it was a man, but not like any man I'd ever seen. Said he moved without making sound, and could speak with the birds. I thought he was just delirious from exposure, but he seemed so certain about these details. Said the man had taken his friend first, and came back for him later. That's when he tried to run. Got turned around in the woods and lost track of time." Dennison's statement continues with a detail she found particularly troubling. He kept talking about the watching place. Said the man had taken him somewhere where he could see everything but not be seen. Said it was like being inside the mountain itself, with tunnels that went on forever. Talked about rooms full of things collected from hikers over many years. Watches, compasses, cameras, all sorts of personal items arranged very carefully like a museum. I asked him if he could find this place again, and that's when he got really upset. Said he never wanted to go back to the mountains again. Said something about how the man had marked him so he would always know where to find him. Dennison added further recollections in a 1968 interview with Dr. Thornton. "There was something else Mr. Caldwell said that I didn't put in my official statement because it seemed too fantastic. He talked about how this mountain man could change his shape somehow, not like turning into an animal or anything that dramatic. But he said the man could fold himself to fit into spaces that seemed too small or stretch to reach things that were too high. Said he moved in ways that didn't seem natural, like his joints worked differently than a normal person's. I remember him saying he climbs like an insect, fingers and toes finding holds that aren't even there. I figured it was just the delirium talking, but the way he described it, with such specific details, has stayed with me all these years." In her interview, Dennison also recalled Caldwell's description of his captor's appearance. He described this mountain man as impossibly old, with skin like tanned leather, all wrinkled and creased, but still strong. Said his eyes were the worst part, clear and bright like a young person's, but with something ancient behind them, like looking into a well that goes down forever, is how he put it. Said the man rarely spoke with words, but when he did, it was in an accent so thick and old-fashioned that Caldwell could barely understand him. Mostly he communicated with gestures and those whistling sounds. Caldwell claimed the man could perfectly mimic any bird call or animal sound, but would add something to it, some extra note or pattern that made it into language. The official investigation treated this as a case of exposure and delirium. Caldwell was released after a week of observation and returned to his home in North Carolina. He refused all further interviews and, according to county records, sold his property and moved to Arizona by the end of the year. James Whitaker was officially declared missing, presumed dead, in December of 1953. His family erected a small memorial stone at the Rocky Knob Overlook, which remains there to this day. While Caldwell avoided public statements about his experience, his medical records indicate he sought ongoing psychiatric treatment in his new location. Notes from his therapist, Dr. Alan Werner, obtained during the 1965 Freedom of Information request, suggest that Caldwell continued to struggle with the aftermath of his ordeal. Patient maintains consistent narrative despite 4 years of treatment. Refuses to accept psychological explanation for his experiences. Insists on literal truth of encounter with what he alternately describes as the mountain man or the watcher. Continues to report sensation of being observed even in secure environments. Most troubling is his insistence that he sometimes hears The calling sounds, despite being over 2,000 miles from Virginia. Recommend continued treatment and medication. Dr. Werner's notes document a gradual deterioration in Caldwell's condition. Patient increasingly agitated during our sessions, reports finding small stone arrangements outside his home on multiple occasions. Believes the watcher has found him despite his relocation. Has begun covering all mirrors in his home. Claims he sometimes sees something else looking back at him. Most concerning is his claim that the scars on his back change position when he sleeps. Objective examination shows no actual movement of scar tissue, but patient's belief remains unshakable. Have increased medication and recommended weekly rather than monthly sessions. A particularly disturbing entry from Dr. Werner's notes dated September 1957 reads, "Patient arrived for session in highly distressed state. Claims to have received a message from the mountain man. Produced small wooden carving similar to figures described in his original account. Crude human shape with exaggerated eyes and ears. Insists he found it inside his locked home, placed on his pillow. Figure appears hand-carved from single piece of wood, possibly hickory. Patient refuses to touch it directly. Police report shows no sign of forced entry at residence. Have retained figure for further examination and increased patient's medication. Recommend possible inpatient observation if symptoms continue to escalate." The case might have ended there, filed away, as one of the many tragedies that occasionally befall even experienced hikers in remote wilderness. However, a journal was discovered during the renovation of the Rocky Knob Ranger Station in 1968, hidden inside a wall cavity. The journal, authenticated as belonging to Leonard Pritchard, contained entries that cast the events of 1952-1958 in a disturbing new light. In an entry dated June 2, 1953, 1 week after Caldwell's recovery, Pritchard wrote, "Met with T.C. today before his discharge. He spoke more clearly than the official report suggests. He described a man living deep in the valleys, far from any trail or road. Said this man had a network of shelters, some barely more than holes in the ground covered with branches. T.C. claimed they were held separately. Said the man would watch them for hours without speaking, sometimes mimicking bird calls to communicate over distance. I asked about W, and T.C. just shook his head. Said the man had taken a liking to him. When I pressed for details, he shut down completely." A subsequent entry, dated June 5, 1953, reveals Pritchard's growing concern. Consulted with Sheriff Grayson today regarding T.C.'s statements. He advised keeping the information confidential to prevent panic or vigilante activity. Agreed that I would conduct discreet inquiries among the older residents who might have knowledge of anyone living in those remote areas. The description T.C. provided tall, gaunt, with a long gray beard and clothing made partially from animal hides, matches stories I've heard from locals about a figure they call the Old Man of the Mountain. Always assumed these were just folklore. The journal entry continues with a troubling revelation. Grayson showed me something that Deputy Jenkins found at that hunter's campsite last November. A small wooden carving of a human figure with oversized eyes and ears. Crude workmanship, but somehow unsettling. Jenkins says it was placed at a vantage point overlooking the camp, like it was watching. Reminds me of something I saw once in a book about Appalachian folk traditions. Watchers or sentinels placed at property boundaries. Going to check county historical archives tomorrow. A later entry, dated June 7th, documents Pritchard's historical research. Spent afternoon in county records office. Found interesting material in Historical Society archives. Collection of letters from early settlers in this region, 1790-1820, mention encounters with solitary mountain dwellers who were neither fully integrated with settler communities nor part of native tribes. Letters describe individuals who had gone wild and lived according to their own laws in the deepest mountain hollows. Several accounts mention territorial markers and warning signs left by these individuals. Stone arrangements, carved figures, and specific patterns cut into tree bark. Most interesting was a count from 1817 describing how these boundary signs were to be respected if one wished to travel safely through certain areas. Perhaps what we're seeing is a revival or a continuation of these practices. Requires further investigation. Pritchard continued his documentation with excerpts from the historical materials he discovered. June 8th copied passages from Journal of Andrew Caldwell, possibly ancestor of T.C., dated 1817 EU 1823. Describes encounters with what he calls the hollow people, individuals who had rejected society to live deep in the mountains. Caldwell writes, "These solitary dwellers are not to be approached directly, as they view all strangers with deepest suspicion. They have developed customs and habits peculiar to themselves, including methods of moving through the densest forest without sound or trace, and ways of communicating over great distances, using calls that mimic local wildlife, but contain patterns recognizable to those who know what to listen for. Most curious is their practice of collecting small objects from travelers who pass through their territory, not as theft, but as what they consider a form of fair exchange for safe passage. Those who resist this custom or who disturb their boundary markers often find themselves becoming lost, sometimes for days, with no clear memory of their experiences upon return." The journal continues with Pritchard's growing fascination. June 9th found additional references in county birth and death records. Several entries from 1850, 1860 list cause of death as taken by the mountain or lost to the deep hollow. Local registrar at that time apparently accepted these as legitimate causes without further investigation. Also discovered pattern of occasional individuals listed as returned to the forest rather than deceased, always adult males between 30-50 years of age, typically following some personal tragedy, loss of family, financial ruin, or return from war, Mexican War in these cases. Suggests a voluntary abandonment of society rather than accidental death. Current registrar dismisses these as quaint euphemisms from less educated era, but consistency of phrasing across different record keepers suggests established cultural understanding of the phenomenon. Pritchard's journal reveals that he began his own unofficial investigation, exploring regions of the national forest far from established trails. In an entry from September 1953, he noted, "Found unusual structure today Appalachia, 12 miles northwest of Mabry Mill. Crude shelter built into a rock outcropping, almost invisible unless you're right upon it. Signs of recent habitation, ashes still warm. Unusual arrangement of stones nearby and distinct pattern. Left area marked for return with proper equipment." A subsequent entry elaborates. Shelter contained few personal items, handmade tools, some dried plants hanging from ceiling, crude bedding of animal skins. Most interesting was a stick map, scratched into a flat piece of bark, showing what appears to be trails and water features. Several areas marked with symbols matching those found at the Whitaker-Caldwell campsite. Took photographs, but left everything in place. Don't want to alert whoever uses this place that they've been discovered. The entry continues with a description of artifacts found near the shelter. Approximately 50 yards from main structure, discovered what appears to be some kind of ritual or ceremonial site. Circular clearing with central stone cairn, various items arranged around perimeter, animal bones, feathers, unusual rock formations. Most disturbing was collection of man-made objects clearly belonging to hikers or campers, watch faces, compass needles, knife handles, all separated from their original housings and arranged in specific patterns, reminiscent of how a magpie or crow might collect shiny objects, but with evident purpose and organization. Left site undisturbed but thoroughly documented. Weather deteriorating, will need to return to station before dark. Pritchard's account of his return journey suggests he may have been observed, felt watched entire hike back to vehicle, several times heard movement in underbrush parallel to my path, but never caught clear sight of anything. At one point, distinct sound of two-note whistle from ridge to east, answered by similar call from direction of creek to west. Proceeded as calmly as possible, resisting urge to run. Found vehicle undisturbed, but with small pouch of unidentified dried herbs placed on driver's seat. No idea how someone accessed locked vehicle. Left herbs where found and departed area without incident. A later entry shows Pritchard's increasing personal involvement. September 16th. Took samples of herbs found in vehicle to botany professor at community college. He identified most as common medicinal plants: yarrow, boneset, various mints. One specimen, however, he couldn't place. Similar to ginseng in some respects, but with different leaf structure and root system. He's sending it to University Herbarium for identification. Meanwhile, I've been experimenting with brewing tea from the herbs, excluding the unknown specimen. Produces calming effect and seems to improve clarity of thought. Perhaps this was intended as gift rather than threat. If so, suggests nuanced understanding of human behavior from whoever left it. The journal indicates Pritchard never returned to that specific location. His next entry, dated October 4th, simply states, "Something followed me from the hollow, watching the cabin at night. Superintendent denied request for additional patrol resources, says I'm chasing folklore." An entry from October 8th provides more detail. Third night of disturbances, something circling the ranger station after midnight. Makes no attempt to break in, just moves around the perimeter. Left arrangement of stones on porch this morning, similar to pattern seen at the shelter. Message, warning, called Harlan Willis, who's lived in these mountains for 80 years. He recognized my description of the stone pattern. Says his grandfather called it a boundary mark. Said I should leave something in return, suggestion of tobacco or salt. Says whatever's out there wants acknowledgement, not confrontation. Pritchard's next entry indicates he followed this advice. October 9th, left small pouch of tobacco and salt at edge of clearing. Disturbances stopped immediately. Willis says I've been introduced properly now. Says the mountain has watchers older than the trails or the roads. Not sure what to make of this, but practical results can't be denied. No further sounds last night. The old mountaineer, Harlan Willis, would later become an important source for Dr. Thornton's research into the case. In a recorded interview from 1966, Willis elaborated on the traditions he had shared with Pritchard. The old people, they had ways of dealing with the mountain. Wasn't just a place to them. It was alive somehow, had its own wants and needs. Some folks, they'd go so deep into those hollows, they'd start to change, become more like the mountain itself. My granddaddy talked about men who'd gone to live wild in the deepest valleys. Said they weren't exactly human no more, but they weren't exactly not human either. Said they'd watch over certain places, keep people from going where they shouldn't. Said if you respected them and their boundaries, they'd leave you be. Might even help if you were lost or in trouble. But cross them, and they'd make sure you never found your way out again. Willis continued with a personal recollection. When I was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, I was hunting up near what they now call the Rocky Knob. Got myself turned around in bad weather. Couldn't find my way back. Night was coming on, and I knew I was in trouble. Then I saw this figure watching me from between the trees. Tall man, but something not right about him. Moved too quiet. Knew the land too well. He never spoke a word to me, just motioned for me to follow. Led me to a ridge where I could see my way home. Before he left, he took my hunting knife. Just reached out and took it from my belt. I was too scared to object. Left me with a carved wooden bird instead. Still got it somewhere. After that, I always left a little tobacco whenever I went hunting in those parts. Never had any trouble again. Willis expanded on his understanding of the mountain dwellers. They ain't like regular hermits or recluses. It's not just that they want to be left alone. It's that they've become something different by living so deep in the wild. My grandmother called them the changed ones. Said they start out normal enough, usually men who'd had some terrible experience in the world of people, war, loss, persecution. They'd go to the deepest hollows to escape, places where even the locals rarely ventured. But stay there long enough, and the mountain starts to change you. You learn to move different, see different, think different. Start to understand the patterns of the forest in ways regular folks can't. The old-timers said some of them lived for extraordinary lengths of time, but they paid for it by becoming less and less human with each passing decade. Willis described the traditional understanding of these figures' capabilities. The stories say they develop abilities that seem impossible to regular folk. They can predict weather changes days in advance. They know when animals are about to migrate or hibernate before there's any visible sign. They can find water underground just by listening to the earth. Most strange is how they move, silent as shadows, quick as lightning when they need to be. My uncle swore he once saw one of them leap from the ground straight up into a tree, 30 feet or more in a single bound. Said it moved like its bones were hinged different than a normal person's. Of course, that might just be tall tales growing with the telling. But there's usually some truth at the core of these mountain stories. Between 1953 and 1956, 4 more hiking groups reported unusual experiences in the same general region. Each account shared certain details: strange calls in the night, a sense of being watched, and small items missing from their camps in the morning. In 2 instances, hikers reported glimpsing what they described as a tall, gaunt figure, watching them from a distance before disappearing into the forest. None of these encounters resulted in disappearances or injuries, and each was documented as a curious but ultimately harmless incident. One report, filed by a group of university students hiking during spring break in 1955, included a detailed description of an encounter that exemplifies these experiences. We were camped near Rocky Knob when we began to feel like we were being observed. That night, we heard whistling sounds that seemed to be coming from different directions, as if multiple people were communicating around our position. In the morning, we discovered that several small items were missing: a pocket knife, a compass, and a metal cup. Most disturbing was finding a circle of small stones that had been arranged around our campsite during the night, with an opening in the circle pointing east toward the trail. Our guide seemed unsettled by this and insisted we pack up and leave immediately. A member of that hiking group, William Davidson, later provided additional details in a letter to Dr. Thornton. What the official report doesn't mention is what happened when we tried to document the stone circle. Mark, our group photographer, started taking pictures, and immediately we heard this piercing whistle from the ridge above us. It was answered by another whistle from the opposite direction. They kept calling back and forth, getting faster and more agitated sounding. Then we heard what sounded like someone running through the underbrush, coming straight for our camp. We couldn't see anyone, but the sounds were unmistakable. We grabbed what we could and ran, left half our gear behind. When the guide went back later that day with 2 local rangers, everything was gone. Not just our equipment, but the stone circle too. All evidence had been removed. Davidson included a further observation in his letter. The strangest part of the whole experience was how differently our group members reacted to the encounter. Those of us who were city-born were terrified, convinced we were being threatened. But our guide and one group member who'd grown up in rural Appalachia had a completely different interpretation. They insisted we weren't being threatened, but introduced to and assessed by whatever was out there. Our guide kept saying, "It's just the old mountain ways. They're letting us know whose territory we're in." He seemed to view it as a normal, if uncommon, wilderness experience, rather than something to fear. Another member of the group, Elizabeth Harmon, would later share her own perspective. What Will's letter doesn't capture is the profound sense of age we all felt in that moment. It wasn't just fear, it was a sudden, overwhelming awareness that we were in the presence of something ancient, something that had been there long before us and would remain long after. The whistling sounds weren't threatening exactly, but they conveyed a sense of evaluation, like we were being measured against some standard we couldn't understand. Our guide told us later that we should have left something behind, tobacco or food or even a small personal item. Said it was a way of acknowledging that we were visitors in someone else's domain. When I asked who that someone was, he just said, "The old ones who keep the deep places." Wouldn't elaborate beyond that. Park Service records from this period show a subtle shift in trail management. Without public announcement, certain backcountry campsites were quietly closed or relocated away from specific hollows and valleys. Trail maintenance logs from 1955 include an unusual notation: reroute section between mile markers 142-147 to maintain minimum 500-yard distance from eastern ravine system per superintendent directive. No explanation for this decision was provided in the official documentation. A former trail maintenance worker named Joseph Carter, interviewed by a local newspaper in 1970, offered some insight into these changes. We were told certain areas were being reclassified for wildlife conservation, but that wasn't the real reason. The higher-ups were spooked about something in those deep hollows east of the main trail. There was one foreman who'd been working the area for decades, fellow named Davenport. He told us there were places in those mountains where we just weren't supposed to go. Said the old man of the mountain didn't take kindly to disturbances. Most of us laughed it off as superstition, but I noticed none of the local workers would venture into those ravines, even in broad daylight. Carter continued with a personal anecdote. One time we were clearing a section of trail after a storm, and I wandered off a bit to answer nature's call. Came across this weird arrangement of sticks and stones, kind of like a little doorway built against the side of a rock. Curiosity got the better of me, and I poked at it with my walking stick. Whole thing collapsed, and I didn't think much more about it. That night in camp, the locals were real jumpy, said they'd been hearing the calling all afternoon. Next morning, I found my boots had been taken right from where I'd left them outside my tent. In their place was a little figure made of twigs, all bound up with some kind of plant fiber. Davenport took one look at it and told me I'd been marked. Said I needed to leave an offering where I'd found that structure I'd knocked down. Made me hike all the way back there with a pouch of tobacco and a silver dollar. Felt foolish doing it, but I got my boots back the next day, found them sitting right in the middle of the trail.